All right, so I'd like to talk about lab. Now, apparently, a video which kind of gave an overview of like the lab for the midterm is not longer. So how about that's what this video becomes? So let me, I want to talk all about lab, which would be like the upcoming stuff. But why don't I just quickly review stuff beforehand. So for example, there's a document, it's kind of redundant. I don't think there's anything all that special here. Because in lab, you have a blue packet that says like out of the first lab, we want you to get this, this, and this, and I kind of have my own stuff here. But let's just say you were to open this and you say, oh, for the blood lab, yeah. So here's the stuff, describe the centrifuging of blood. So in other words, I mean, you spin it, and what do you get? You get 3 layers, the plasma, the buffy coat, and the hematocrit layer. If you were to say like, oh, which of these blood cells transports, gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide? Oh, that's the erythrocytes, etc. So I've been reviewing this at the end of each lab. And in a few minutes, I'm going to review, lab 4, lab 5, etc. And if you were asked like the lab midterm, like, what is that on? It would just kind of be like all of your lab quizzes to date combined. So for example, let's just start off with the blood one. On the quiz, you had to identify 4 blood cells. On the lab midterm, you'll have to identify 5. All right, and I'm going to talk about the in-person one. The online one would essentially be the same. Like there might be like a minor difference here or there. So that would be the main identifier. Online, there might be a couple more identifies. So if you remember, there was like, the images from our blood test analysis, like is this high hematocrit or low hematocrit? Would this person have an issue with their clotting factors, etc. So a few more of those are on the in-person or the online lab. Now, the online lab has one more advantage in that you see where it says like interpreting blood test result and blood quiz. All of the multiple choices come from here. So if you want to study for and identify here, like, well, what would the blood cell look like? Obviously when I go to lab, it'll be whatever I find under the microscope. But here I'm literally using one of the images you've studied before. So if you were to go through this and this, you have seen every question that could be asked on the lab midterm. All right, so there was those, perhaps what people get confused with the most, so let me kind of go through this, are the blood typing and the blood tests. So there were 3 blood tests that we went through: a total red blood cell count, a total white blood cell count, and a differential white blood cell count. The total red blood cell count, that's like you spin blood and you measure the hematocrit. All right, what percentage of the blood is red blood cells? A low level could mean anemia, a high level might mean blood doping. A total white blood cell count is where you just want to say how many white blood cells are there. You're not distinguishing between neutrophils and eosinophils. So you could measure the buffy coat, you could burst the red blood cells and count who's left. But anyway, these are your white blood cells, because a high level could mean you're battling an infection or maybe even leukemia. So that's a total white blood cell count. The third one, that's the differential white blood cell count. That's where you're going to go along a microscope slide and say neutrophil, neutrophil, lymphocyte, neutrophil, lymphocyte, monocyte, neutrophil, neutrophil, lymphocyte, and count them like that. And then at the end say, of the white blood cells I counted, 60% were neutrophils, 30% were lymphocytes, 15% were monocytes, etc. You get a percentage of the different kinds of white blood cell. So let me just repeat, in a differential white blood cell count, you're counting the different kinds of white blood cell and the percentages of each, because, high neutrophil count, that might mean, a bacterial infection. High eosinophil count might mean a worm infection. I gave you lots of different examples. On the exam, I would just ask you then for one, just how would you do a differential white blood cell count? What might an abnormal value mean? So you could just remember, what they were. So once again, total red blood cell count, total white blood cell count, this here. So interpret the test results of the blood work like high hematocrit. There's going to be a few more of them on the online version than in the in-person version. And once again, I mentioned this before, but just so you're aware, the online stuff, I make question pools which are chosen at random. So for example, like if like here were the different types of this blood test we do, if there were 5 questions, I'll just make a pool, and then when you get the exam, you get one picked at random. So obviously now you can't call your lab partner, not that you would, but like that other lab table, they might do that. Call your lab partner and say like, oh, the blood clotting one, it's the person who's at risk of hemorrhage, because that was the question you got. You could get a different question then. Okay. Just on counting, what are the most common white blood cells which 2 are the most common of the following? And neutrophils and lymphocytes are the most common. Eosinophils and basophils are the least common. Blood typing obviously is an issue. So one question is, if your answer choices are anti-A antibodies, anti-B antibodies, anti-Rh antibodies, what would you make if you were B positive? What would you make if you were A negative? So you just pick those. Once again, online, you have every combination, right? So every possible way of asking the question is asked there. So, that's a good place to go. And then finally, if I say this person's giving blood to that person, what would happen? So if the person getting the blood isn't making antibodies against what's coming in, then it's fine. If the person getting the blood makes anti-A antibodies or anti-B antibodies, and you're giving them A or B, right? So if they're making anti-A and you're giving them A, if they're making anti-B and you're giving them B, that's bad, they could die. The third thing is, if there's not an ABO problem, but the person receiving the blood is Rh negative, and you're giving them blood with a positive, then the answer is that could be okay the first time, but not after. All right. So there will be those questions on the in-person thing Thursday afternoon. Or if you're taking the online version, that's what you see here, right? The blood stuff. It's just like the quiz that you took, the class quiz. This is really similar. So that's that. The next topic was the heart anatomy. So on the heart anatomy, it was mostly anatomy. So there was the types of muscle. So you could see a picture of skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and identify which it is. Okay. There were parts of the heart which were external, like on the outside. Here's the apex, here's the base. Here's the atrioventricular groove, the interventricular sulcus, here's an auricle. Right, that was on the outside of the heart. Once we cut into the heart, then there was the layers. That will be asked on the beef heart, not on a model. That's epicardium, myocardium, endocardium. So I'll ask one, right? I'll ask you the layers. On the quiz, you were asked 2 chambers, 2 valves, 2 vessels. On the lab midterm, you'll be asked 3 chambers, 3 valves, 3 vessels. So once again, you get the idea. It's not different. It's exactly the same. Just maybe the numbers are a little bit more. So 3 chambers, like maybe 2 on a model, 1 on a beef heart or whatever. So you say, oh, left atrium, right atrium, etc. 2 valves. All right. Once again, I don't like to ask the pulmonary semilunar valve on the cow, just because that's hard to reach. Just so you know. And then 3 of the 4 vessels. The vessels would be vena cava. You could write vena cava, but I'll be asking the superior one. The pulmonary trunk, the pulmonary veins, and the aorta. Right. So 3 of those. I'll probably ask 1 or 2 more things on the heart, like chordae tendineae or the interventricular septum. All right, so we had a couple of things that didn't fit into a chamber of valve, the coronary sinus, for example. And then there's just these 2 multiple choice questions. One would be put the following in order, and you say, oh, right, vena cava, right atrium, right ventricle, pulmonary trunk, lungs, pulmonary veins, left atrium, left ventricle, aorta. All right, so hopefully that's easy by now. And then the final one would be on the circuits. Which of the following are true of the pulmonary circuit or systemic? Is the right ventricle the pump or the left ventricle? Do the arteries have the oxygenated blood or the deoxygenated blood? Okay, so that would be this second one here. The third one looks a lot like the quiz that you just took, where the only two identifies will be parts of the ECG. All right, so I'll once again draw an ECG and just say, oh, that's the P wave, that's the T wave, that's the QRS complex, that's the ST segment. So there'll be two of those. Right. Everything else is, multiple choice or written. So let me just kind of like review what they might be. And once again, if you were wondering, so this is, there's a blue packet, and I just kind of personalize some of these here. But here, like I said, there's two that you'll be asked to identify here. Match the ECG on what occurs in each. So, if you've got answer choices like P wave, QRS, what's the depolarization of the atria? What's the repolarization of the ventricles? When do we hear the first heart sound? QRS complex. When do we hear the second heart sound? The T wave. If I gave you the autorhythmic things in a mixed up order, you could say, oh, yeah, SA node, AV bundle. Okay. So there's that. Okay. If I said, what heart sound is best heard from this spot? All right, let's say the fifth intercostal space to the right of the sternum. You'd say, oh, that's the right AV valve. Right, the AV valves make sense. The right one's heard on the right side, the left one's heard on the left side. But when you're in the second intercostal space, that's where the semilunar valves are heard, and they don't make sense until you think about the anatomy of the heart. It's like, oh, right, the aortic semilunar valve, that is best heard in the right of the sternum in the second intercostal space. It is the pulmonary semilunar valve that is best heard on the left of the sternum in there. If there was a picture or a model, especially online, what pulse is this? That's carotid. This one's radial. This one, if you got a stethoscope here, that's an apical pulse. What causes normal heart sounds? I'm sure you've noticed, if you've been reading these, that if there's parentheses, that's where I give you the answer. All right. Normal heart sounds, that's the turbulence in the blood after the valves close. All right. So it's not the slamming of a door. Like it's not like the valves slam shut. It's they close and the blood swirls around. That's what makes them. So it's the turbulence in the blood. That's what makes the normal sounds. And an abnormal sound could be like a narrow valve, or a valve in the wrong place, or a valve that doesn't close completely, or a valve with calcified valve flaps, etc. Okay. Okay. So once again, here's one a lot of people get. What causes the systolic and diastolic pressures in the arteries? Why do we get a blood pressure reading with a high value and a low value? And what I'm looking for in parentheses is the systole and the diastole of the left ventricle. I have a blood pressure that's 120. It's the systolic value. Why? Because the systole of my left ventricle puts that much pressure in the blood. And I have a diastolic pressure of 80. Why? Well, because when my left ventricle is in diastole, that's how low the pressure goes. How is a blood pressure reading taken? Now, once again, just if my instructor made a video that had 4 steps, and said, then was going to ask me a question, I'd try to incorporate the 4 steps, at first, blood's flowing freely, no sound. We pump up the pressure, we stop blood from flowing, or no sound with that. Then as we lower the pressure, when the pressure in the cuff equals the highest pressure in the artery starts to spurt through, and that's when the sounds start, the sounds of carotid cough. All right. But then as we lower the pressure in the cuff, when it equals the lowest pressure in the artery, the diastolic pressure, blood flows freely again, the sounds stop. All right. So a blood pressure reading is the sounds when they start, sounds when they stop. All right. A lot of things would increase blood pressure, like exercise, stress, nicotine, etc. Standing suddenly would decrease blood pressure. If I asked you, if you had a high cuff pressure for a minute, what would happen and why? Well, your arm would become cool and pale because you're blocking arterial blood. All right. If you had a low cuff pressure for a couple of minutes, what would happen and why? That's venous congestion. Arterial blood can get to the arm, venous blood can't come back. And so the arm becomes warm and that purplish blue color called cyanotic. Right. Now, as you know, I lost it. There are, just like there are lecture videos I've been using, there are lab ones. I mean, you've seen them, but just, there are playlists that I had to go along with each lab. So if it were me, before I took a quiz or before I took that section of the lab midterm, I would say, oh, my if you went to the trouble of making the AP2 Lab Quiz 4, here are all of the videos which will help me out with the Lab Quiz 4 stuff. Like I would watch them, or go through that for the lab midterm. Let me review then the quiz that you'll take today, the quiz 4, and then that'll get us into quiz 5 rather quickly. So there are the easy ones. All right, so the easy ones are, sometimes I can do the pictures faster. The easy ones are if I showed you one of this and I say, what's the blue layer? You say, oh, tunica externa, tunica media in red, tunica interna in green. If I ask, where's the smooth muscle that does vasoconstriction? Oh, that's tunica media. If I said artery versus vein, if it's an artery, tell me which kind. You would say, oh, okay, well, the vein has the thin wall, it collapsed. The artery has the thicker wall, it's circular, so that's the artery, that's the vein. But I look at the artery, I look closer, I see elastic fibers, that is an elastic artery. By the way, I apologize in advance. The elastic artery that we currently have in lab is good, but this was just beautiful. And I can't get these slides anymore. So we used to have like one for each lab table, like 10 back in the day. But they've kind of like AMP1's kind of destroyed them. And the new ones which come in, they're just not the same quality. So just so you know, this is really nice. The one we have, it's good enough, but it's just a little less quality. Sorry, but it's not for lack of trying. Here we have an artery and a vein. Notice the vein, very thin wall. Here the artery is a muscular artery. So you would have that identified. If I ask you artery versus vein, obviously that's the artery, that's the vein with the valves. There's the capillary things where I'd said, you've got the continuous capillary, the fenestrated with the pores, the sinusoid. Here I could ask you one of those. How did we demonstrate filtration? In that filtration setup, pressure was pushing water through the holes. Little stuff went with the water through the holes, the big stuff stayed behind. The same thing is happening at capillaries. And so that was a whole bunch of the lab objectives. Then there are 3 things that I could ask you on the fetus on today's quiz. So I could ask you on that model that has the fetus and the placenta, what's this red thing in the liver? And you could say, oh, well, he's only going to ask me the one thing on this model, the ductus venosus. So the red thing, which is connecting the umbilical vein to the heart, going through the liver, that would then be the umbilical, that would be the ductus venosus here, because blood gets oxygenated in the placenta, it goes through the umbilical vein, it reaches the liver, and then goes through the ductus venosus here, and I guess that's the next one. Yeah, the ductus venosus. If I ask a multiple choice question, what's the adult leftover of the ductus venosus? You would say the ligamentum venosum. Second difference in the fetus is there's a hole in the heart. So connecting the left and the right atrium, there's a hole that's called the foramen ovale. So if I showed you a fetal heart and I asked you the hole, you would say that's the foramen ovale. Multiple choice question, that would be the fossa ovalis, right? The depression in the adult where that hole once was. Finally, in the on the fetal heart, there is a connection between the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. Right there, there's a connection. The two aren't separate. That's what's called the ductus arteriosus. And in the adult, there's a little band of collagen there called the ligamentum arteriosum. All right, so there could be one of 3 things that I ask you to identify. And then I could ask you a multiple choice question. What's the connection in the fetal heart between the pulmonary trunk and the aorta? Ductus arteriosus. What's the remains of that in the adult heart? You would say the ligamentum arteriosum. Okay. Then finally, in lab, if you go to lab, there's a little handout. If you're at home, you can see it here. I then give you, if you wanted to go to the brain and back, here are the blood vessels you would use. So what I can now do is just make these multiple choice answers, mix them up, and you put them in order. All right. So that's what's going to be on the quiz today. You've got a word bank. And then I'm going to ask you, how would you get blood to and from these two places? And then one of them will be worth 2 points, one's worth 3 points. If I ask you, how do you get blood to and from the foot? You say, oh, and by the way, there's 3 possible questions I could ask you: foot and back, hand and back, arm and back. On the quiz today, I ask you 2. On the lab midterm, all 3. Just so you know, that's how we do. Same thing in the lab midterm. It's not different. It's just maybe a little bit more. The foot and back's the easy one, because now you don't have to worry about left and right. You're just like, oh, okay. So you would just go from let me just talk about the quiz first, then we'll go through these solely because I've got models and stuff, obviously. But if you go to foot and back, there is another way back through the great saphenous vein. I just want to mention that. But I would just ask you this question. So if I ask you foot and back, you're going from the arch of the aorta to the, we call it the thoracic aorta here, the abdominal aorta. I don't have to worry about left to right. The way back through the veins is the same. So if I'm going common iliac, I'll go through this. Common iliac to external iliac to femoral to popliteal to tibial. Once I get to the foot, the veins look the same way back. Tibial to popliteal to femoral to external iliac to common iliac. That was easy. So the foot's easy. The hand is a little harder because you have to worry about 2 things, left or right. If I say right hand, from the arch of the aorta, you go to the brachiocephalic trunk before the subclavian. On the left side, you just go from the arch of the aorta to the subclavian. So on a quiz, you might actually then have a blank space at the end of one, and that's okay. All right, because if I have one set of blank spaces, that could be either for the right or for the left on the in-person quiz. Then if you say, no, I did them all, just you realize because I was working on the left side, I didn't need that brachiocephalic trunk space. So you have to worry about that. And then secondly, if you're going to the medial side of your hand, that would be your pinky side. You get there the ulnar artery, you come back the ulnar vein. If you're going to the lateral side, the thumb side, you go there the radial artery, you come back the radial vein. You never do both, because some people will pick that ulnar artery, then radial artery, then ulnar vein, then radial vein, and they run out of spaces. No, you're just, there's different ways to go to the mall. You pick one, you don't do both. Okay. Is that okay? So that's the hand and back. The brain and back is the most complicated in that first there's left and right. So on the right, you go through a brachiocephalic trunk. On the left, you don't. So there's that. But then there's 2 different ways to get to the brain. When I ask it in person, the way I always do it is I'll put carotid first. There's 1 answer choice less, and then I'll ask the vertebral path second, where there'll be 1 answer choice more. All right. So on both of them, if I'm on the left side, you go from the arch of the aorta into the left common carotid or the left subclavian. If I'm asking the right side, there's the brachiocephalic trunk. So arch of the aorta, brachiocephalic trunk before you get to the carotid, or arch of the aorta, brachiocephalic trunk before you get to the subclavian. So you'll just be asked these in a mixed up order. On today's quiz, I'll ask you 2. On the lab midterm, I'll ask all 3. Now, it's easy for me to review all of this while I go through how to identify them. And that'll be my next thing. I'm going to turn the lights on. I know you'll see this a little less, but I'll be referring more to models that I'll be holding up at the same time. So just if anyone's saying I'm not good on this, it's not entirely clear, I'm about to review it with models and such. And hopefully that makes it more clear. But this is the end of quiz 4, okay? And then quiz 5 is just to identify them. So as I go through them, quiz 4, the pathway part, and quiz 5 kind of go together in that, here subclavian, axillary, brachial. On quiz 5, you're identifying that's the subclavian, that's the axillary, that's the brachial. All right, so they kind of go together. Yes, you had a question. Yes, both pathways. So it'll say blah 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 and blah 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 blah, and there'll be 2 sets of blank answers.
Okay, so you want us to break down both, we're answering.
So if it's to the brain and back, where there are 2 different ways to get to the brain, the question will be worded give the 2 routes. The first set of answer choices has 1 less answer choice than the second one. So the first one would obviously be the one for the carotid, the second one for the vertebral. If you ever wanted to add and then subtract, you could change it, but I'm just saying that's how it's laid out. But you would be asked, get blood to the brain and back going through the carotid pathway, through the brain and back, through the vertebral pathway. Let me hit some of this. Now, I've done this before, so I apologize in this room. Yeah, I've actually asked about the lighting. Okay. So you've got a bunch of different videos. You've seen these before that go through the pathways. Like if you want to go, here's the one. The one that I'm going to like focus on now, like we played it before, I'm going to be showing you the real models. I think this is helpful because this helps you with the pathway. That's quiz 4. But the model that I'll ask it on, which is quiz 5, is right next to it. So I think that's a neat one to go side by side. So let me just kind of do that. Oh, I forgot a heart. All right, let me just be back in a second. All right, so one of the reasons, I love the cat is because there are just some things we don't have good models of. All right, so like not only is it nice to see them on the cat, there's some things you have to see on the cat because we don't have a good model. So if we were to take blood to the brain and back, okay? If we were to start at a heart, we go to the arch of the aorta. Right? So I'm kind of reviewing quiz 4 and 5 at the same time, and those sections of the lap midterm at the same time. Arch of the aorta first. Now, this first thing here is the brachiocephalic trunk. All right, that's only on the right side. So the brachiocephalic trunk would then lead to the right common carotid and the right subclavian. Notice that the left common carotid and the left subclavian, they come right off the arch of the aorta. So if I'm taking blood to the brain and back, all right, on the right side, brachiocephalic trunk for both of the pathways. The carotid pathway on the left common carotid comes right off the arch of the aorta. The vertebral pathway on the left, the subclavian comes right off the arch of the aorta. But then also identify, if I asked you this, you would say, oh, that's the brachiocephalic trunk, the left common carotid, the left subclavian. And in general, if you just write subclavian, that's fine. All right, so there's no part where you absolutely have to write left or right. Now, on the models, like I said, I like the cats. For those of you at home, I have a video where I go through blood vessels of the cat. When we go to lab, I'm going to ask everyone to gather around, and I'm going to talk about the cat that way. But here on this map, or models like this, this is where in the neck region, you can see the common carotid very nicely. So on either side of the trachea, that's the common carotid. And then on the other side, you'll see a blue one, that's the jugular. Okay, so, and internal jugular specifically. So common carotid is easily seen here, and then the jugular there. There are a couple of models that kind of show like a head thing like this, where we can see the common carotid, and then right around the position of the larynx is when it splits. The easy one to follow would be the external going to jaw muscles in the face and the like, but that's not our focus. Remember, our focus is brain and back, hand and back, foot and back. So that the focus would then be on the internal carotid, which is now going to go through the temporal bone to the brain. So common carotid would be here, and then the internal carotid would be the harder one to see going towards the brain. So once again, on the pathway, arch of the aorta, brachiocephalic trunk on the right side, common carotid to internal carotid, and then on quiz 5, it would just be like, oh, that's the common carotid, that's the internal carotid. Vertebral arteries. Well, I mean, you can see why they're called vertebral arteries, because the cervical vertebrae, one of the things that makes them distinctive is that they have holes, the transverse foramina, that the vertebral artery goes through. All right. So not only can I get blood from the common carotid to the internal carotid, where it will reach the brain, but then also from the subclavian through the vertebral artery. So if I point to this artery here in the middle of the cervical vertebrae, that's vertebral. Or if you notice here, if you notice here on this model, the vertebrae have an artery going through them. So if I were to indicate that one, and forgive me, I'm not blowing up the thing here. Oh yeah. Yeah, people at home, I'm assuming that you can see me pretty well. Would it be better? Actually, I'll bet it wouldn't. So hold on. I'm sorry, people at home. I have an idea. Go get bigger. Where's the command to get bigger? I want to know. Is it here? Somewhere I pinned. There we go. Maybe I stopped sharing then. People at home, I'm sorry. I think you can see this better now. I should have thought of it. So here on this model, you can see that there is a common carotid, then an internal carotid. All right, I'll make this bigger for you guys as well. Whereas here now you can see there is a vertebral artery actually going through the vertebral column. All right. Now there are a couple of models which now look like this, but now we look inside the head. The two vertebrals come through the foramen magnum, and then they form this one single basilar artery. All right. So the two vertebrals, they come in separately, but then right where my fingertip is, right, is the basilar artery where the two vertebrals come together. So if I'm taking blood from the vertebral pathway, we go from the subclavian to the vertebral to the basilar artery. All right. And that's why the vertebral pathway has one more empty space, because on the carotid, it's common carotid, internal carotid before we get to the circle. On the vertebral pathway, it's subclavian to vertebral to basilar. All right, so there's one more blank on the vertebral. The basilar artery leads to this circle, that's the cerebral arterial circle, and then the internal carotid comes into the same circle. So even though there's two different pathways, we get to the same region of the brain, the cerebral arterial circle, and from there arteries branch off. So there are two ways to get blood to ways to get blood to the brain. We can go, let me just talk about on the right side, arch of the aorta, brachiocephalic trunk, common carotid, internal carotid to the cerebral arterial circle, and then the brain tissue. Or you could go brachiocephalic trunk to the subclavian, to the vertebral, the two vertebrals together come together to form the basilar, and that gets to that cerebral arterial circle. Now, both of the pathways have the same way back. Let me repeat that. When blood comes back from the brain, it does not matter whether you got there through the vertebral or the carotid, you come back the same way. There are spaces in the brain called, or in the meninges called dural sinuses. So you may notice here, just remember we used with the coronary sinus, the term for just a vein that's a little wider than a normal and a thinner wall was the sinus. So here we see sinuses in the dura mater, that's one of the meninges called dural sinuses. So dural sinuses will collect the blood, and then from there go into the internal jugular. All right, so in our throat, we see these two blood vessels on either side of the trachea. The red one is the common carotid, the blue one is the internal jugular. Now, this will be easy on the cat as well, but I think you would do yourself a favor if you could imagine that you see the letter Y twice. So here is the base of a Y, all right, that's the superior vena cava. That then branches into two brachiocephalic veins. So just a note, in the arteries, only the right side has a brachiocephalic, but in the veins, they both do. So the arteries are asymmetrical, but the veins are symmetrical. We have a left and right brachiocephalic vein. The brachiocephalic veins then split into a internal jugular and a subclavian vein. So coming back from the brain, we go through the internal jugular, the brachiocephalic vein to the superior vena cava. So once again, no matter which of those two routes got you to the brain, carotid or vertebral, you come back the same. Dural sinuses, internal jugular, brachiocephalic vein, superior vena cava. Okay. So for the quiz for today, you want to be able, you can put them in order. For the quiz Thursday morning, you want to be able to identify them. And just, I'm happy to, like, I have ideas. I'm happy to change ideas. So for example, the blood identification quiz is scheduled for Thursday morning because, you know, I wanted you to have time to look at the cats, etc. But you're going to have an hour of open lab this morning, more than that this afternoon. Let's say someone this afternoon says, you know what, it's a shame the quiz is Thursday morning because I'm ready to take it now. I'll set it up now. Like we could do this Thursday. I'm not saying you have to, but I'm just saying that type of thinking. Like if you know, we've got all these different people, not everyone is always at exactly the same point. If, you know, identifying blood vessels is what you'd like to do, you know, before you leave and go home today, if you master it, you know, after you do the lab notebooks, we could do that. So that's how you would get blood to the brain and back. Number two, how would you get it to the hand and back? Well, start off with some of the sames. Arch of the aorta, we're going to go the brachiocephalic trunk to go to the right arm, but the left subclavian comes right off the arch of the aorta. So going to the left arm, there's no brachiocephalic trunk. There's a subclavian. Now, I'll be honest. Could I ask, we have a couple models that look like this. Models that look like this technically have everything. So technically I could ask like anything on this model. But most of these are better seen like on the big leg or the big arm. So I don't use these a whole lot. All right. So one of the ones I could use them on is the subclavians, like right under the clavicle. All right, that is, subclavian literally means under the clavicle. That's where we would have the subclavian artery and vein. That being said, the left subclavian in the cat is just so long and just so easy to identify. If I wanted to ask you the subclavian, I would almost certainly be asking the left subclavian on the cat. If I'll get to the vein on that one in a second. If I wanted to ask you the brachiocephalic trunk, once again, beautiful on the cat. So those would be ones I'd be likely to ask on the cat. If we were to get to arms, from the subclavian, oh, I'm sorry. Well, I'm not sorry, but yeah, this arm is really nice in the forearm. It's missing the axillary. We have a couple of arms. If you have a blood vessel here in the armpit, the Latin word for armpit is axilla. So the artery here is the axillary artery. Once you get here, there's only one place where you have to identify arteries and veins. I'll get to that in a second. Everything else, you could just say brachial or radial or ulnar, because I'm assuming you know the difference between red and blue, the artery and the vein. They would have the same names. All right. The only two places where that's different is the lungs, which I'll get to, and also the throat. They don't have the same names. Common carotid and internal jugular are obviously different. So if I'm pointing to the blue one, you would have to say that's the internal jugular. The red one is the common carotid. But so if you're getting blood to the hand, all right, on the right side, arch of the aorta, brachiocephalic trunk, to right subclavian, on the left side, arch of the aorta, left subclavian, to the axillary, and I'm sorry, my other one has a longer axillary artery. And in the upper arm, we have a brachial artery. So in here, brachial, and you could just write brachial. The models that we have, they're arteries and not veins. And if you were like, oh, like on a cat, if I asked, but I probably wouldn't on a cat. Like if you pointed to the red one or the blue one, just write brachial. That's. And then we get to the forearm, and then you can cheat. The ulna is your medial bone. So the ulnar artery and vein would be the medial one. The radial artery and vein would be the lateral. All right, so if I asked you here, ulnar artery, here, radial artery. So if I'm asking you how you get blood to your hand, in the question, I would specify left or right hand. That would be brachiocephalic or not. And then I would specify medial pinky side or lateral thumb side. And then if I said the medial side, you would say ulnar artery, ulnar vein. If I said thumb side radial artery and vein. From the ulnar artery or vein, or on the lateral side radial artery, we begin to get to a brachial vein, the axillary vein. Okay, so again, a model like this, you would see it. All right, so here, you could have a radial ulnar vein, then this would be the brachial vein. You get into the armpit region, the axillary vein. And then once you get to the Y, that's where I would like prefer one of these models. So here, the axillary vein comes into the subclavian vein. The subclavian vein fuses with the internal jugular to make the brachiocephalic vein. The two brachiocephalic veins form the superior vena cava back to the heart. Okay. So that was reviewing quiz 4 pathway and also identify here. On leg and back, we would go from the arch of the aorta to a thoracic aorta that you can only see on the CAT. We don't have a good model of the thoracic aorta, but on the CAT, I can pull the lungs back and say, see this, red tube, that is the thoracic aorta. From the thoracic aorta in the abdomen, this model is very good for the abdominal aorta. So notice the abdominal organs here, right? The abdominal aorta is getting to the thigh region. So if I were to use this model, all right, my two favorites on this model are abdominal aorta and inferior vena cava. All right, so like I like to pick out of all of the models we have, what model best shows this and use that one. This model, abdominal aorta going down, and then inferior vena cava coming back up. All right. Then we reach the hip region. If you remember, there was a hip bone called the ilium. And so this is where we start getting into what are called iliac arteries. All right. So the abdominal aorta in red is then going to branch to make a common iliac artery. Here's the common iliac artery. All right. And then from the common iliac artery, we have a branch going out to the pelvic organ. So this would be the internal iliac artery. But then we also have a branch that goes out to the leg. That's the one we're following, the external. So from the abdominal aorta to the common iliac artery to the external iliac artery. All right. And on the way back, just because I don't feel like holding this up again, if that's okay with you, we would be coming back the external iliac vein to the common iliac vein to the inferior vena cava and back to the heart. Once again, if I asked you to identify that, I would just put a piece of tape over both of them, and you would say, oh, that's the common iliac. That's the external iliac. And I assume you know the difference between red and blue. So here, the external iliac is in the pelvic body cavity. But then we leave the pelvic body cavity, all right? And then we are in the thigh. This is the femoral artery and vein. And you're following the femoral artery and vein along. You're like, oh, beautiful femoral artery and vein. I see it, I see it, I see it. And all of a sudden you don't see it. Because in the adductor magnus muscle, it goes through a little space called the adductor hiatus. And so the femoral artery is visible from here to here, and then it disappears. It doesn't appear again until we look on the posterior of the knee, where we call it the popliteal artery. So it pops out behind the knee. We call it the popliteal artery. And once it goes into the lower leg, there is an anterior and posterior tibial artery. I'm just going to point to the one we see here on the model, just call it the tibial. So to get blood to the foot, you would go arch of the aorta, thoracic aorta, abdominal aorta, common iliac artery, external iliac artery, femoral artery, popliteal artery, tibial artery to the foot. And then you would just come back through veins of the same name, tibial vein, popliteal vein, femoral vein, external iliac vein, but I would use that model for. The external iliac goes into the common iliac, into the inferior vena cava. Okay. So that is pretty much all of the vessels. If I were to add 3 more, it would be, there's another vein in the leg that I always ask on the CAT, but you can see it nicely on this model as well. See, there's a very superficial vein. This is an alternate route back if you don't want to go through the tibia and the popliteal. This is called the great saphenous vein. It's very superficial. And one of the benefits of a superficial vein is if you're doing a bypass surgery and you say, wouldn't it be great if we could get like a little blood vessel that we could cut from one part and now attach the heart so it can go around the blockage? That's an easy one to get because it's so superficial. But it's also very easy to see in the cat. So I tend to ask it in the cat, but I mention it here. The only other blood vessels, and this is where you just have to be a little careful. Everywhere else, you do not have to say artery or vein except for the lungs, right? And the artery and vein, I'm going to ask you to say pulmonary artery or vein. And remember, it's tricky because in the lungs, the pulmonary arteries are blue and the pulmonary veins are red. So let me just repeat, this is the pulmonary circuit. In the lungs, you would have to say artery or vein. And in the lungs, the pulmonary arteries are blue, pulmonary veins are red. So I have tried to review the pathways one more time before you to take your quiz, right? Because, you know, I figured that would help. But in doing so, I've also reviewed the material for the 5th quiz, which is scheduled for Thursday morning. But if you wanted to take it last thing this afternoon, you would be welcome to. There's all of these. And what am I doing here? Oh, yeah. Notice at the bottom, I'm just going to show it here. If you're at home or you want to study at home, notice I've got what I'm going to do in lab. When we go to lab, it is my intent to go through blood vessels and say, hey, everyone gather around. You know, here's this blood vessel. Here's the brachiocephalic. But if you're wondering, oh, wouldn't it be great if there was a movie on that? There is. All right. So, you know, if you were hoping to review, I go through the I'll be happy to go through this in person here. If for those of you, if you came in Thursday morning, I'd be happy to do it in the open lab with you as well, but I have a video for that. This then ends the review for the material for quiz 5, which is all identify. All right, so all identify. So that's the subclavian, that's this, that's that. That just leaves the 6th part. So notice there's blood vessel 5, just identifying blood vessels. There's the written stuff. And if you looked at your objectives, all right, you would say, oh yeah, every now and then, like, yeah, describe how you would take a blood pressure reading. That's a written question. All right, describe the process of filtration. That's a written question. So here where you see written, you know, no surprises. You know, there'd be like, oh yeah, that's a written question. The only thing that I have not yet described is this lymphatic section, which is extremely short. All right. So if it's okay with you, I'd like to go through the lymphatic section here. Now, if you were to look in the lab first half, there's a couple of question sets here, which I would like to go through this afternoon in lab. So notice immunoassays, what's going on with there? Like Gram test, coronavirus test. These are like using antibodies to diagnose. I mean, relevant to everything we're talking about, and for a lot of you, what your jobs will someday be. But I didn't want them to be part of the exam. So here's a couple of things, just reinforce lab concepts here, but seeing them on the quiz here, and I'll review them later. This is the last you'll see them. You will not see them on the exam. So the only questions on the lab midterm from lymphatics are here. And there's the very short lymphatic notebook that you could do here. Okay, so let me now review this. I'm going to stop sharing again. So what are we looking at? Well, this will not take long. If I were to say, what's this or this? All right, it's like brown tissue right there. You could look, a couple of you have scrunched up your faces and you can't see that. That was actually the wrong response. Your response should have been, oh yeah, there's only one thing he's going to ask on this model, a tonsil. All right, so if I point to one of these, I ask you, what is that? Oh, you say, oh, all right, it's the only thing he's asking on this model, it's a tonsil. So for the lymphatic system, the tonsils are going to be here. Okay. If this is my model of a lymph node, All right, so then if I have this sitting out and I say, what is this? You would say that's a lymph node, right? There's different vessels coming in. The lymph kind of goes through here where the white blood cells can screen for problems. And then you have the two efferent vessels. That's a lymph node. If this is a model of the small intestine, the pancreas, at the very end of this is the spleen. This is the largest mass of lymphatic tissue in the body. So you would identify that as spleen. There are lymphocytes called T lymphocytes, so named because they are they mature in the thymus. The thymus is largest in the newborn, and so that is why I would use this image from here, the thymus of the newborn. A question which I could ask, I think I have it online, but I don't, and I think it's like one of the lab notebooks things, but I won't ask it in person. This is something we'll go into greater detail later. This is the lining of the small intestine, and in the last part of the small intestine, there are masses of immune cells called Peyer's patches. All right, once again, the only thing that would be asked on this model is a Peyer's patch. Okay, and here we have the large intestine, and coming from the tip of the large intestine is what's called the vermiform appendix. All right, so if you see a model of the large intestine, the only thing that you would be asked there is the vermiform appendix. So on the lymphatic system, once again, you can see that there are then some structures which can name, but there aren't that many, right? So there's the lymph node, the spleen, the tonsils, the appendix, a Peyer's patch, maybe, probably not in person. That wasn't that much. And notice that all of the models, there was only one structure on each model. So once you see the model, you say, oh, I don't even have to look at what he's pointing at. I already know what he's going to ask. The last part of the lymphatic system is, if you remember, when fluid leaves capillaries and doesn't return, it comes back then through lymphatic vessels, which will end where the brachiocephalic vein forms. So where we have the brachiocephalic vein forming, and this is where the lymphatic trunks end up coming. So there's a right lymphatic duct that's draining the right half of the head and the right arm. The thoracic duct on the left side is a little bigger, also draining the inferior part of the body. If I asked you what's that, you could say A, it's a lymphatic duct. Full credit. You could say that is where lymph is returned to the body. Full credit. Okay. So on the lymphatic system, there are some identifiers. The next thing that we're going to talk about is we talk about where hormones are made. Oh, and I just wanted to, while we're here, and this is in the lab notebook for this week, so while we're on it, if this is the larynx that we were talking about, just so you know, on the sides of the there is what's called a thyroid gland, two lateral masses, and then an isthmus which connects them. So this would then be the thyroid gland that we'll be talking about on Thursday. And then behind the thyroid gland are these little nodules called parathyroid glands in pink. All right, so we have a thyroid and parathyroid. Over the kidneys, all right, we have adrenal glands. All right, so we'll be talking about the adrenal glands here. The thymus will come up. And I think the only other thing is, I was just sharing the screen, and we were to, what's fastest? The hypothalamus in the brain is actually part of the endocrine system, as is the pineal gland of the brain. And hanging from the hypothalamus, we have the pituitary gland, anterior and posterior. So we can talk about these on Thursday, but in the middle of the brain, if you say, all right, let's just look at what's called the diencephalon of the brain. I have a model of this. That would be the hypothalamus. Behind that's a pineal gland. And then we have the pituitary gland, which has an anterior and posterior part. Okay. So there can be some identifies. And in the lab notebook and online, I might ask you an endocrine thing or two where you say, oh, that's the adrenal. There are 4 written questions on lymphatic. So I'm going to give you 4 things and ask what they do. Okay. So 4 things and ask what they do. So the lymphatic lab, which will be in the lab midterm, some things to identify. Okay. The cat, the thymus, and the spleen are easy to see. I'll identify, but actually I won't ask you that on the cat. Here is the written question. All right. So these 4 things, I'm going to ask you what they do. So when I ask, what do lymphatic vessels do? Well, we know this. They collect fluid, which has left the circulatory system, and then they return it to the circulatory system. So here, where the lymphatic trunks are emptying back to the brachiocephalic vein, this fluid is being returned to the blood. What does the spleen do? It filters blood and looks for infection. So the spleen's function is filtering blood and looking for infection. What does a lymph node do? It filters lymph and looks for infection. So the spleen filters blood looking for infection. The lymph node filters lymph and looks for infection. What does the thymus do? This is where T cells mature. T lymphocytes mature in the thymus. Okay. 2 more questions on the lab exam. Okay. On the blue packet that you have, it'll say like identify like the spleen under the microscope, or et cetera. And I told you this before, I'm going to modify that. I'm going to ask you when I show you pictures of either the tonsil, the thymus, the spleen, the lymph node, the nose, or the Peyer's patch, or the appendix, I'm going to ask you, what are you seeing? So if I show you the tonsil, what are you seeing here? Gobs of white blood cells, just white blood cells everywhere. If I show you the thymus, what are you seeing? Gobs of white blood cells. If I show you the white pulp of the spleen, you are seeing. And the same with the lymph node or the Peyer's patch or the appendix. Once again, the point is we call them blood cells. They're not. 98% of them have left the blood and are in the lymphatic tissues. These, like in the blood, there's a white blood cell over here, there's a white blood cell over there. But here, everything you're looking at is white blood cells. So if I have 2 microscope slides or images online, and I ask you, what are you looking at? Gobs of white blood cells. Okay. So I am going to post the video that I've just recorded online, which kind of like gives a review of your lab objectives. So if this is helpful to study, but once again, we've done this in quizzes. So this is going to, let me just, for contrast, so you can see this a little better. I'm just going to get the link. This is just like the quizzes. So we've had a quiz on blood, a quiz on the heart anatomy, the ECG, blood vessel wall and pathways, identifying blood vessels. There is no quiz on lymphatics. These will just be a handful of questions on the exam. Not many, a couple of identify. They're not that hard. That's the spleen, that's the lymph node, that's the site where lymph is returned. 4 written ones. Oh, what does the spleen do? It filters blood looking for infections. What's that under the microscope? Oh, that's gobs of white blood cells. All right, so not overly overbearing. So you can take these online, you can take them in person, and then I'll take the highest score and put them together. What to do now? Well, so actually I'm going to stop recording because this is kind of like just specific for you guys.